I'm Parag Khanna, Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington. How to Run the World is really about diplomacy, but I coined the new term mega diplomacy. And the reason is because we tend to think of diplomacy as just being among governments and states, but in fact, it's moved far beyond that. You find a wide range of actors involved, whether it's corporations, NGOs, religious groups, philanthropists, and so forth, and universities as well. So there's so many players in diplomacy that I feel we have to call it mega diplomacy because it involves all of these different stakeholders. In fact, it's hard to think of a single public policy area on the global stage, whether it is human rights or climate change or public health, financial stability and so forth, that doesn't involve dialogue, and that's what diplomacy is dialogue and negotiation among public and private actors. So really just about everyone who has the authority to speak for themselves, to represent themselves, who has financial or other kinds of resources, is getting involved in this mega diplomacy. I think mega diplomacy is a big departure from traditional diplomacy because the traditional world of diplomacy that is centered around states, intergovernmental relations, and international organizations really is about centralizing authority, about having specific hubs or nodes where these kinds of activities take place. Instead, in mega diplomacy, it's very coalitional, sort of coalitions of the willing, and it can involve it's situational. At any given time, you find that governments partner with NGOs and companies to get something done on the ground, out there, not in a negotiation in New York at the Security Council, but rather, how does an NGO potentially hire a private military contractor to help secure its aid convoys somewhere, and how does the African Union's peacekeepers play a role in securing that same zone? You find that there you've got a private military company involved, NGOs involved doing humanitarian work, UN agencies doing the same, and then African Union, a regional security organization as well. That's an example of a coalition. One of the most common things that's been said with the WikiLeaks cable revelations is that it's the end of diplomacy. And it's funny because it fits into a pattern that I describe in my book of people being very shrill and calling for the end of diplomacy as a result of technology or media and communications. And in fact, diplomacy has always been in competition with those forces. With the invention of the telegraph in the 19th century, it was Lord Palmerston received that first telegraph at Whitehall, and he said, "This is the end of diplomacy." And in the White House and State Department, prominent figures like Brzezinski, when he was National Security Advisor, said, I've got a subscription to the New York Times. What are all these embassies for at all? So there's always been that competition, but diplomacy obviously perseveres. It adapts. It is the second oldest profession, as the joke goes. We will always have diplomacy. We'll always have diplomats. They will have to be faster. They'll have to be smarter. There are some things that aren't worth keeping secret. They'll have to try harder to keep certain things secret that are. But you will always have a need to communicate either, again, bilaterally or with other actors. So WikiLeaks itself has become a player in this mega diplomacy. It is a force to be reckoned with. It is a player to be negotiated with, but it doesn't signal the end of diplomacy. My first book, which was called The Second World, had a very lengthy chapter on Egypt, in which I described it from the inside out. I spent months traveling in the country. I said, this country is ripe for revolution. Look at these deeper forces at play. For decades, the United States has propped up, supported, underwritten these regimes at the expense of having deeper relations with the people and the citizens. And so Egypt becomes a major test case for the need now, the imperative. Now the United States has no choice but to make friends as broadly as possible within each country. You can't simultaneously push for democratization and then only speak to the head of state. Right, you have to be aware that in democracy you don't know who's necessarily going to win each election. So you have to have connections with the Muslim Brotherhood, with secular opposition, with minority parties, with the military, with the regime, and so forth. So that requires a lot more diplomacy in a way. And it requires obviously a lot more public diplomacy, that outreach to parties, to aspects, communities in society that are not in power. And so it really speaks to this idea of mega diplomacy, creating connections across these stakeholder groups and not focusing strictly on the intergovernmental. So there's a lot of lessons that, I think very few of which have actually been internalized yet by the US government in what has happened in the region, but it's very much long overdue. I mean, How to Run the World is obviously an ambitious title and it speaks to everyone. And one of the main messages is the book is that everyone is a diplomat. As I mentioned earlier, anyone who is an authority or any unit, whether it is a church, whether it is a university, whether it is a company or an NGO, they're all participants in diplomacy. And I found so many examples, filled the book really with examples of how um, everyday citizens really become participants in diplomacy through the charitable donations that they make, through going abroad and teaching English, through investments that their companies make in corporate citizenship programs. So I find that really there's almost no group that you can't touch on and draw into this new diplomacy. So really the audience is absolutely everyone.